Thank you, happy.
From subatomic particles to emanating points of light in our universe, this is a Captain's Log, the Star Trek talk show that speaks vibrant volumes to carbon-based life forms in our Milky Way galaxy. I'm your host, Brian Kreutz, joined as always by the greatest of all Star Trek fans and my elegant and equivalent host, who I place on a pedestal so high it's Lily Fox-Lim.
More specifically, this carbon-based life form guest we are thrilled to have this week is a notable physicist credited and working as a science consultant on the 7th season of Star Trek The Next Generation. Also, he was a science consultant through all seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, as well as a writer on the last two mentioned series. But André Bormanis has done so much more, including writing the book Star Trek Science Logs and serving as technical advisor for the reference book Star Trek Star Charts in 2002. And there's more, but we don't want to sound like a babbling Mr. Data from Season 1 Next Generation.
No. Now, a babbling Mr. Data is renowned for being an asset to the crew after Picard told him to stop babbling. I'm glad Picard isn't here to tell us to stop babbling because we have such a cool guest with us today, Lily. Once again, we bring you Trekkies positive aspects to a creative scientific side of Star Trek. André Bormanis, who is a former NASA scientist who also worked as a scientific consultant on the Fox National Geographic production of Cosmos and as a consulting producer for the following seasons. André is also a co-creator of the National Geographic miniseries, the series is called Mars, and is also a writer and co-executive producer for that series. He's currently a writer and co-executive producer on the Fox hit TV series The Orville, right? That's that Next Generation, like, homage, like, love letter to Star Trek The Next Generation.
It truly is. Seth MacFarlane knowingly loves Star Trek.
He does.
And André Bormanis also serves on the board of directors of the Griffith Observatory here in Los Angeles, fundraising for a nonprofit organization called Friends of the Observatory. We love the Griffith Observatory! Don't we
do, Lily!
Anyway, let's not forget André also worked on all 4 Next Generation feature films, starting with 1994's Star Trek Generation.
Hey, Lily.
Yes, Brian.
Tractor beam me into oblivion.
Let me tractor beam you into the mid-1980s, actually.
Okay.
Kim Carnes had a monster hit with Betty Davis Eyes and won a Grammy for Best Song and Best Album in the 80s. A few years later, the second incarnation of Star Trek emerged as The Next Generation, along with Captain Picard and a bevy of new characters, including a navigator named Geordi LaForge, who had been blind since birth. And who knows, maybe Betty Davis Eyes really inspired a team of scientists from my alma mater, Stanford University, who implanted a small chip behind the retina of blind rats that enabled them to pass a vision recognition test. The science behind bioengineering is almost exactly as proposed on Next Generation, with a few earthly changes, of course.
Oh, wow, you're extremely smart. Stanford University right there, folks.
I've been monitoring your communications from the subspace beacon left by Raj the android. Quite the technological hack. Picking up on your eyes and retina story of Geordi. By wearing a pair of glasses fitted with a micro camera, the subject can see when the chip implanted behind the retina is activated, where electromagnetic impulses are interpreted by the brain in the same way photons or light waves are interpreted as visual images. Light enters the camera and is processed by a micro wireless computer, which then broadcasts it as infrared LED images to the diode receivers in the brain. Those images are reflected back into the retina chips to stimulate photodiodes. The photodiodes replicate the lost retinal cells of the bionic eyes and send electrical signals, creating images that rival natural human sight.
Now, Geordi's visor had the gift of sight, and that's Star Trek technology at its pinnacle. Enabling a blind human to see is very special.
Indeed, Brian. Gene Roddenberry himself created Geordi's character in honor of Geordi LaForge, a quadriplegic fan of the original Star Trek who died in 1975. The LaForge character was also written into the 1980 Star Trek novel, The Galactic Whirlpool by Star Trek original series writer David Gerrold. Today, several types of visual prosthesis are in development, and one device has been approved for sale in the European market. As of 2006, 16 blind people worldwide have had sight partially restored in a procedure where electrodes implanted in their brain intake impulses from a camera, allowing patients to see lights and outlines of objects. Similarly, a device has been developed by our very own space agency, NASA.
It really is, and with all of this Trek-worthy insight into vision, I want a tractor beam BK here, Joanna. So the character is Geordi LaForge. What episode title in Next Generation was the first when Geordi pulled off his visor, revealing his blindness?
This is remarkably easy, I must say. It was the naked down when Geordi handed his visor to Dr. Beverly Crusher. Open the gates! That's your line usually. Now it's my turn to tractor beam you, Lily. Okay?
Okay.
When was Geordi first seen wearing the artificial bionic eyes that made his eyes look blue?
This is a tiny little tedious trick of the mind, but I know both answers. Geordi was first seen wearing those bionic blue eyes in the Next Generation series finale, All Good Things.
Boom!
So partly in your backyard, okay, in south of LA in Temecula.
Yes.
But if we're talking Prime Universe and not to cue the misanthrope possible future, then the answer is the 1996 film Star Trek First Contact.
Gosh, this is crazy. You always get these. I can never stump you on tractor beam me.
You two are impeccable and remarkable with your Trek knowledge. What is remarkable about the visor that Geordi wears is that instead of light, they use the electromagnetic spectrum to send images directly to the brain. Visor properly stands for Visual Instrument and Sensory Organ Replacement. After a receiver chip is installed in Geordi's brain, he can see even beyond what is considered normal human eyesight, which use the same basic physics as the original visor that Lily mentioned in the film, and the possible Q future. Bye for now.
A captain's log returns in a moment.
From low skies of the planet's stratosphere to science of writing and production in Star Trek and beyond. This season, we've been fortunate to have Doug Drexler from Star Trek's production crew. Now this week, we welcome the man behind the science of Star Trek's consulting and the spin-offs, the man who wrote and produced tons of Star Trek. Hi, Lily. Nice to see you slide into the camera here.
Oh yeah! Lots of Trek flavor to talk about with Andre, from the Next Generation to Deep Space Nine, then on to Voyager, and one of my favorite series, Star Trek Enterprise.
Yes.
Let's welcome André Bormanis to our show. Welcome to A Captain's Log, Andre.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Like Bryan, you were born in the Midwest, Andre, but you moved out west. In your case, you moved to Arizona. How did you get your start at a young age in physics and astronomy and then onto creative writing? And was there anyone's work that you grew up admiring in particular that you wanted to emulate or draw inspiration from?
Well, I fell in love with astronomy at a pretty young age. We moved from Chicago to Phoenix when I was 7 years old. And back then, you could see the stars pretty clearly from suburban Phoenix. And in the summer, you could even kind of make out the Milky Way just a little bit. And started to get library books about astronomy, started to learn the constellations. I got my first look through a telescope when I was 11 years old, looking at Saturn, and that just took my breath away. And this is also when the Apollo program was happening, first lunar landings, and it was an exciting time to be interested in space. I was a big Star Trek fan, original series, and it didn't really register with me when it was originally on the air because I was a little kid. My older brother watched it, and I sometimes watched it with him. It wasn't until I was in high school that I really started to see Star Trek in reruns and get into it, and became a huge fan along with many of my other friends. And yeah, a lot of writers that influenced me: Ray Bradbury, Robert A. Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, loved their work. Also loved Carl Sagan, and was definitely interested in the physics of astronomy, and started reading Sagan. I took physics in high school and math courses, and decided at a pretty young age that I wanted to be an astronomer. And astronomy is basically applied physics. So if you want to be an astronomer, the first step is to get a physics degree, which I did, and did some graduate work in physics, but then got a little discouraged because, I'd see a lot of friends spending 6 or 7 years in grad school and getting a PhD in astronomy, and the only jobs available to them were like in computer programming, which I had very little interest in. But I did love writing, and I did a lot of technical writing. I tried my hand at some creative writing, and parlayed that into some part-time work as a technical writer. Took some screenwriting classes at Arizona State after I'd finished my undergraduate degree. My teacher liked my work. I'd written a Star Trek: The Next Generation spec script in the late 80s, and that was when they had their open submission policy. And I got a very nice thanks, but no thanks. My script was rejected, but it was a polite rejection, and they said, good work, not what we're looking for right now. Feel free to try again.
Andre, even though you didn't get to write for Star Trek right away, it seems like that was the place you were meant to be. And as I understand it, you had a rather unique entry into Star Trek: The Next Generation's final season in 1993 as the science consultant. Please tell us how that came about and what drew you to work on this very successful syndicated series that had already hit its stride.
I was offered the job a couple of years later of science consultant on Star Trek. The guy who had been doing it, Naren Shankar, also a physicist, he was promoted onto the writing staff, and so they were looking for somebody to replace him. And they wanted somebody who had both the science background and understood, space science, astronomy, physics, who knew the show. And of course, huge Star Trek fan, I'd written a spec script. And they wanted somebody who knew how to talk to writers. And by virtue of the fact that I, wrote a competent spec script, they figured, oh, this guy seems to know what he's doing. He seems like somebody that we could work with. Had an interview with Jeri Taylor. She was, I think, a supervising producer on Star Trek: The Next Generation at that time, and we kind of hit it off over the phone, and she invited me to come out to LA and meet the gang, and I met Michael Piller and Brannon Braga and Renee Echevarria and Naren Shankar and Ira Steven Bear, and it was like, oh my God, I'm meeting all these amazing people, right, whose names I'd seen in the credits and whose work I respected, Ron Moore. They liked me and they hired me, and they needed me to start literally to the week that a NASA fellowship, I was getting my master's degree under at George Washington University, finished up. So I spent 2 years at George Washington University getting a master's in science, technology, and public policy, which combined my interests in the space program, writing, politics, and the history of the space program. Great stuff, great program. But in May of 1993, I moved from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles to become the science consultant on the final season of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was, I think, season 2 of DS9. And once I became comfortable in that job and they liked what I was doing, I finally started pitching some story ideas. They eventually bought a couple for Voyager. And then the following season had me write a script, which they liked very much, and had me do another one. And so I ended up writing or co-writing 6 or 7 episodes of Voyager while I was still working as the science consultant. And when Voyager ended and we started Enterprise, Brannon Braga, who created that show with Rick Berman, said, we just want to bring you onto the writing staff. It doesn't make a lot of sense that you're not here day to day and part of the writing staff. And so that was my first full-time staff writer job in television. And really, I'd have to say those first 2 years of writing for Star Trek Enterprise is where I really, really learned how to write for television. Because when you're down in the trenches, they say warriors are made on the battlefield. And we had to do 26 episodes each year for those first 2 years. And we had, 8 or 9 people on the writing staff, all very talented, but man, you really start to feel the pressure of that production schedule, knowing when every one of those episodes is supposed to start shooting in that season, and knowing you have to have a script done, or you create a delay that costs the studio a lot of money, and that's a situation you never want to be in.
Andre, so you had the science and writing background for what Star Trek The Next Generation needed at the right place and the right time for your lit agent to get you in touch with the Next Generation team over at Paramount. Now, please tell us about a story on the first episode of The Next Generation that you remember that required heavy-handed sets of science consulting to enhance fictional narratives.
Voyager was created as TNG was winding down.
Okay.
So I was consulting on Voyager from the beginning, from the pilot. I didn't start pitching stories to Voyager until, the first season was well underway.
Okay.
I pitched some Next Gen stories in the final season of Next Gen, and none of those were accepted. But yes, I did find out about the science consultant job through an agent, a literary agent in the TV business. And one of their clients was Naren Shankar, and that's how she knew that, Naren had been promoted onto the writing staff, and therefore they needed a new science consultant. So I had a couple of good friends who I grew up with who had moved out to Hollywood after college to become TV writers. One of them had become pretty successful in the sitcom world. And so I asked my friend Clay Graham, a guy that I've known since second grade, so, is there any way that you think I could get a pitch meeting at Star Trek just to go in and pitch story ideas rather than, writing another 60-page script and sending that to the office. And he said, well, you really need an agent to do that. And he said, look, you've written that Star Trek spec script. I'd written a feature screenplay, an adaptation of a novel. I had treatments for some stories for Star Trek. And he said, let me ask my agent if they know of anybody. Well, that agent recommended somebody to me. They weren't interested. They recommended me to somebody else, who recommended me to somebody else. And so I just passed my stuff along to all of these different people. I don't know how many agents looked at my work before I finally found somebody who was interested in representing me. A woman named Carrie Kelsey at an agency called Montero Rose, which was what we call a smaller boutique agency. They were not representing, the big time, stars and writers and directors and so forth, but they had very, very good clients and some science fiction people. I think J. Michael Straczynski, who created Babylon 5, was one of their clients at the time. So I thought, wow, this is great. And Carrie was in the process of trying to get me a pitch meeting when she found out that they were looking for a new science consultant. And she said, I think you'd be perfect for this. They want somebody who has a science background, who is an aspiring writer, who knows how to write, who understands the show, who's a Trekkie, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I happened to be, at the right place at the right time, and subsequently found out that they interviewed quite a few people for that position before they landed on me. And when they met me, they thought, this guy seems great. He seems to really get it. And it's not just going to tell us, that's stupid, you can't do that, which surprisingly, a lot of the scientists who they talk to would in so many words tell them, right?
That's so interesting how you had to balance being scientifically accurate while also stretching your imagination into what could possibly be a part of the 24th century.
A captain's log returns in a moment.
Now, Andre, can you tell us a little bit more about what the behind-the-scenes work looked like for a science consultant like yourself?
Yes. In terms of Next Generation, I knew that was entering its final season, but Deep Space Nine was sort of just getting started. It was just going into its second season. And I knew that they had plans to do another show after Next Gen. Didn't know what that was going to be. Voyager had not been announced yet, and whatever Jeri and Rick Berman and Michael Piller were thinking, I didn't really find out about until pretty late in the final season of Next Gen. So I was pretty focused on that and Deep Space Nine and getting to know those shows. And, another great aspect of that job is almost every day. And again, remember, this is 30 years ago. A courier from Paramount Pictures would come to my apartment, buzz the gate. I'd let them in and they would bring me the pages for that day. Meaning that they would bring me maybe a first draft of a new script, or they would bring me a treatment for a story that they were developing, or some rewrites on a previous script, a second draft of, act 2 of the previous script, right? Could be anything on any given day. I would read that material, and then I would write my tech notes on my little PC and then fax them to the office at Paramount. So I didn't have an office at the studio. I rarely went into the office or to the studio. I went a few times, to say hello, to make sure people remembered who I am and connect the face with the name and that sort of stuff. And of course, the first time I got to visit the sets, I was, beside myself. And that was in and of itself a great education, because I would read a first draft and I'd immediately think, does that work? Does that work? I don't know. I bet they're going to change something here. And, sure enough, a week or so later, I'd see the new pages for that script and, they made a change. Maybe what I expected, maybe not what I expected. But again, that was sort of a great learning process for me. And I knew when they needed input from me, typically, because they would put the word tech in caps and parentheses in dialogue when they were like, not sure what the right word for the doctor to say is here. Or when, Geordi is having, some crisis down in engineering and the warp core is about to blow, what is it? What should he say to save the day? That sort of stuff. Yeah. And, but I'd also just, I would look at the scripts very carefully. And if I had a suggestion for a change in something that had been written, I would, I would include that in my notes. And sometimes I would talk to writers as they were developing a story or a script, if it had a strong science component, and we'd discuss, the science that they were interested in, and I'd try to give them as much background as I could provide. And, and then if need be, I would call other experts in different fields to make sure that we were getting like the latest, best information. So, there was a research component to my job.
Wow, that's so fascinating to learn. The job of a courier sounds kind of tough.
It really does. You're right. Now, it's too bad they didn't have a transporter to beam up any of those scripts anyways.
As a science advisor, you tend to interact mostly with the show's writers, and since you are a writer as well, did you find yourself in the writer's room fact-checking the scientific authenticity of story ideas, like right then and there? Or would you typically discuss it with writers outside of the writer's room? Can you tell us about this process and maybe a couple stories that you recall along these lines for how this process worked from what you remember?
If it was integral to the story, if we're breaking a story and something comes up and there is a technical dimension to that, or a scientific idea, if a scientific phenomenon, some new discovery, for example, is a key plot element in the story, then we'll discuss that in the room,
Okay.
And because typically I'm the one who has some level of expertise in those things, they will defer to me in terms of like, well, what's the right way to say this? Is this plausible? Could this really happen? And, I would not hesitate to stretch my imagination in some of these circumstances, simply because, Star Trek takes place, 400 years in the future. There's going to be a lot of discoveries we make in the next 400 years that, will overturn some of the things that we think are true today that, we might call established science. But we'll find out in the future, maybe it doesn't really work that way. So we can play around with things to a degree. But if it's something very basic, nobody's gonna figure out in the next few hundred years that the average distance between stars in the Milky Way galaxy out here in the spiral arms is something other than 5 or 6 light years, right? Nobody's going to say, "Oh, they're actually 1,000 times closer." No, that's not going to happen, right?
Right.
Other things like that, which are well established, I think we can assume that those things will also be true in the future. But clearly, if we have warp drive and transporters, there are going to be inventions, and we're discovering new astronomical phenomena all the time. And as long as they don't violate our current understanding of the laws of physics, that are well established, then I think, there's a lot of room for nature to be very creative. And there are outstanding mysteries in astronomy today that were mysteries 40 years ago when I was in college, and we still don't quite understand them. Some pretty basic stuff. So, but for the most part, I would, talk with the writers in the room about real science and something that might show up in a story that we think is well established. I remember, I don't know if I pitched this or somebody else pitched it, but we did an episode on Enterprise that involved a rogue planet. It's been discovered in recent years, and these were just, I think, being recognized as, we think these things are out there, and there may be a lot of them. Planets that become untethered from their solar system. So they're not orbiting a star, as all the planets in our solar system do, but they're just kind of wandering through the Milky Way. And they are sort of frozen ice balls because clearly without a star to warm their surfaces, it's very cold in interstellar space, and the surfaces, whatever volatile compounds might be on them, would freeze out, and, the thing would probably look like a big ice ball. And yet, planets, in some cases, have their own internal sources of heat. Half of the heat or so at the Earth's surface really comes from the interior because our core is still very hot, mostly through fission of radioactive elements like uranium. A little bit of that heat comes from the remnants of the planet contracting and cooling when it was formed 4.5 billion years ago. Well, that's an interesting environment. Maybe we could have some kind of a life form on that planet. Cool. That's the speculative part. Yeah. But rogue planets are real, and we now have good evidence to support the idea that there are billions of them just in the Milky Way galaxy, that these are common, features of all galaxies.
Unequivocally amazing what our technology has allowed us to learn about the stars, planets, and great big universe even beyond the Milky Way.
Yes!
It's amazing. Yeah. And, the resolution of telescopes today, and especially the James Webb Telescope, which, is the giant telescope we launched Christmas 2 years ago, I think now. That's at one of the Lagrange points, 1 million some odd miles from the Earth.
Wow, what a lot to take in. There really is no limit to what humans can achieve when they combine innovation, imagination, and science.
But you have to join BK and yours truly here on A Captain's Log to get those Trek 11 questions, which are always tried and true and in your purview, to gain the ultimate Star Trek knowledge.
Indeed, yes. This is thanks to our unbelievable guests.
Bye for now.
And don't bring me happy. Thank you.